Hi, I'm Josh McGrath,
I'm Andrew Haas.
and this is the Art and Pursuit Podcast. Welcome back. Today we're going to continue our examination of pitfalls that are common for men to fall into in the dating phase. And today's episode is titled, Stop Dating for Years, which, Andrew, is probably going to be a bit controversial for some of our listeners today, because what we are advocating for is for men to have purpose and intentionality in the dating phase so they don't find themselves perpetually dating year upon year upon year upon year.
Somehow, I don't know how, but that became a normal thing to date for years. Like, where did that come from?
I think it's just a cultural assumption that you date for 2, 5, 10, 25 years.
It's crazy.
And then at some point, maybe you get married. But at this point in culture, people aren't even getting married because they're experiencing all of the benefits of marriage in a dating relationship. And so it's like, why even move towards marriage? And unfortunately, even within the Christian community, controversial take here, we've adopted a lot of the secular culture's recommendations and assumptions regarding dating.
Yes, something we want to really hit home in this episode is that complacency is a cancer in the dating relationship.
It's true. For some reason, men are very intentional in their pursuit, or they should be, in their pursuit of a woman. She says yes to dating them. And suddenly, in a not too distant future, men fall into the trap of being really complacent and no longer being intentional like they once were.
And we'll unpack this in a little bit, but I think it would do men really well, generally speaking, to treat comfort as the enemy while they're dating.
Because it's so easy for men to pursue comfort and to make that a priority in the dating relationship rather than pursuing a decision, moving in a direction that's going to lead to an outcome of either covenant or not.
Yeah, I mean, change almost by definition is not going to involve comfort. That's just how humans are designed. And the dating phase, leading up to it, entering into it, walking it out, what's on the other side of it, lots of change happening.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to have a purposeful, healthy dating relationship coincide with a comfortable, fun, if you will,
just perpetually existing relationship. Yeah, so there's 4 things that we're going to examine today. Number 1, we're going to look at reasons men allow complacency in the relationship. Number 2, we're going to look at the consequences of not being intentional. And number 3, we're going to talk about the idea that comfort is the enemy of growth. And finally, number 4, we're going to discuss how to avoid complacency. So let's jump in here with number 1. Reasons men allow complacency in the relationships.
Well, to start, we can look at a lot of the internal factors that guys might face in this.
Yeah.
For example, fear of commitment, unresolved personal issues, lack of vision for the future, personal fear, anxiety, fear of failure, and, probably a big one, fear of rejection.
Yeah. Men aren't really good at self-reflection. They're not good at really kind of processing why they feel what they feel or why they're doing what they're doing. We just tend to do things in a very linear and what we oftentimes think is the most logical way. And this is important because if men don't actually take a moment to reflect internally on why they're being complacent, they will just continue operating in this space perpetually until some outside force requires them to change the trajectory they're headed.
One of the marks of a mature man is the ability for him to move forward, to make decisions, even if there are things in his own life, stuff he has inside that might be unresolved or he's not sure about. But it's really important for guys to understand that even with life, when things exist that you might wish weren't there, you still got to move forward. You still got to make a decision.
Absolutely. Now, there are some external factors that may cause a man to be complacent in his relationship. Things like school, financial stability, perhaps parental expectations, sometimes, cultural norms. all of those things can play a role into why a man is being complacent and he actually isn't moving towards a decision.
One of the big challenges that men face are navigating and sorting through all of these things that we just talked about. There's a lot of external factors, there are a lot of internal factors, and I think too many men have all of these puzzle pieces, and it's a real challenge to figure it all out, and so many of them don't.
And once a guy has arrived at kind of the status of being in a relationship, that's a huge win for him. He got the girl, so to speak. I mean, he didn't actually, because it hasn't ended in marriage. That's when he really gets the girl. But he can feel like this sense of accomplishment, and it can feel really good. And there's a lot of unknowns on the other side. And so instead of kind of taking the risk of moving towards a decision, it's like, well, let me just kind of enjoy this season. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying a relationship. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the dating phase. You absolutely should do that. But what can happen for men is that turns into complacency, and that sense of I'm just happy and I'm enjoying this and I'm comfortable and go me, I've got a girl now, can suddenly turn into 1, 2, 5, 10, 25 years of just perpetually dating.
I'll try this analogy and see if it works. I think, for people who have driven standard.
Which is like nobody anymore.
Which is
Gen
sad.
Z's never even heard of a standard.
So sad.
It's all batteries now.
So you're driving down the highway in 5th or 6th gear. And you can think of dating as, second or third gear. You're moving, you're actually going somewhere, but you're not actually to where you're going to be eventually.
Yep.
But if you try driving down the road in second or third gear, you're going to have a really bad time. Whoever's riding in the car with you is going to have a really bad time. And it's like, because that's not how it was designed to be.
Yep.
You weren't meant to stay in third gear on the highway for a long period.
Exactly. And if a man is receiving any, emotional, physical, or sexual gratification from that relationship, things that should be reserved and saved for covenant and marriage, it's going to make it even harder for him to want to pursue intentionality, because the very things that God created to help drive men towards decision making, he's able to participate in and enjoy all outside of the design of marriage.
Well, right, because that's a fundamental reason that men and women are drawn to each other. They desire, to be emotionally close, physically close. Like, those are great things.
Yeah.
But you can't just experience those things. If you experience those things, which are one of the driving factors to get to know somebody, you experience them, and it's like, I kind of got what I was looking for.
Yeah, they're setting up house in the club lounge in the terminal. And I'm like, hey, I love the club lounge, but I want to go there with my wife. I don't want to set up house with my girlfriend there, because that terminal actually is a place that I'm passing through, not a place that I'm trying to reside. And so we want to encourage men always to be intentional and to be moving towards a destination of a decision.
And the second idea we want to talk about are the consequences of not being intentional.
Which, we talk a lot about being intentional on this podcast, about having purpose, having vision, moving towards a direction, moving towards the decision, having authority and accountability in your life. And probably for a lot of our listeners, they can feel like what we're doing is saying you shouldn't have fun when you're dating, and that, it needs to be very rigid and mathematical and methodical, and like it's all got to be mapped out. But in reality, the reason why we recommend this is not because we're anti, feelings. We're not anti having fun. We're not anti being romantic. But we recognize that there are some very real consequences that can negatively impact you as the man, can negatively impact her as a woman, can even negatively impact family, friends, and community around you. And so while a lot of the decisions you make today, if you're only looking at today, you can think there are no consequences. This isn't a problem. This is totally fine. It's a judgment call. This is totally good. And I'm like, sure, today, if that's the only time we're looking, you're probably good. Zoom out months, years, or decades, it's very possible that the decision you are making here actually does have real life negative consequences down the road.
Think about it this way. To your earlier point about, you're taking all the fun out of it. It's all rules. It's all this and that. You want to eat healthy.
Yes.
So,
well, I do, but not everyone does.
For those that want to eat healthy, you start out saying, okay, I've got to have this much protein. I'm going to need vitamins. I got to avoid this food. Can't eat at this certain time of the day. Next thing you know, you're like, wait, you got all these rules in place. Are you actually going to enjoy the food?
Yeah.
Are you, like, is it even going to taste good? And it's like, well, yeah, you get to that. Like, we're going to figure out some structure.
Yeah.
We're going to figure out what's actually good. Up front, it's going to sound like no fun. If all you hear is all the rules around when to eat, when not to eat, all the vitamins you got to take, all the protein you need, it's like, well, that doesn't sound fun at all. Is it actually going to taste good? But yeah, eventually, right, when you get to cooking the food, it's going to taste good.
Yeah.
So that's the goal here. We want to have some structure. We're going to, discuss some things where it's like, well, that doesn't sound like any fun. But that's not where it ends.
Yep.
You get to a place, once all that's figured out and you can walk through something, you can navigate, then you realize, oh, on the other side of it, yeah, there's a place to enjoy life with some structure.
That's a great analogy. So we've identified some of the big consequences that can exist from not being intentional. Obviously, there are hundreds, if not thousands out there. We don't have time to go through them all. We don't even have time to go through all of these in depth. But there's just kind of some big bucket categories that we're going to briefly talk about. And the first one here is a loss of vision, not loss of sight, loss of direction. For a lot of people, complacency, not being intentional, means that they struggle to have a vision that will pull them out of their complacency. Proverbs says that where there's no vision, the people perish. And for men who are called to lead romantic relationships, we've already discussed this, it is incumbent upon them to have a vision for that relationship. And so if they're just enjoying being complacent and being comfortable, they're going to struggle to have a vision that pulls them out of that. And then what begins to happen is it begins to negatively impact not only the relationship, but both individuals.
And the tricky thing with a vision is that it's not a one and done. And a lot of guys will approach vision as, okay, I set a vision. This is what I'm going to do. It's good to go. But then 6 months go by, a year goes by, and things shift or things might change, or you just forget about it and you just don't check in with what your vision was, and you fail to walk in that. It's as if you never had one.
Yeah. Another consequence of not being intentional is you begin to have lower standards in what you consider acceptable in a partner, what you consider acceptable in a relationship, and what you consider acceptable in life. And we've seen this time and time and time again, where when you initially are pursuing each other, there's like, you're going to put on your best foot. You're going to be disciplined. You're going to be courteous. You're going to have good manners. You're going to try to be mature. And then suddenly months or years begins to pass by. The status quo settles in and you're like, I'm comfortable with this person. It doesn't really matter how I act. And suddenly you're accepting behaviors and characteristics and habits that prior to dating, you would have never accepted, but you're like lowering your standards because you're like, I want to keep the status quo. I like being with this person. And so the standards lower and lower and lower and lower. And there's not a call to come higher because there's no commitment to actually come higher. In a marriage, you can call one another higher because you have the commitment of marriage that helps that. But in a dating relationship, it's like, well, she could leave at any point. I could leave at any point. So it's just kind of like, I'll put up with it.
Yeah, I've seen this play out in two ways, primarily. As a guy, well, I guess for either person, you can get to a point where you see all these great things in somebody, and it's like you just allow that to overshadow any concerns that might be there. Like, yeah, they have these things, but there's all these things I love. Or on the flip side, for the individual, I could say, this is who I am, and they need to love me for me, and this is just part of who I am.
Yeah.
And we excuse the poor behaviors, mannerisms, whatever you want to call it. And that allows just the standard to go down for both people.
It's true. Another area of consequence is that men will oftentimes try to avoid confrontation. They want to avoid, I'll use another word, tension. They don't want to have conversations that are going to create any type of confrontation or tension in the relationship, because then that changes the comfortability of the relationship. And so even though certain conversations that they should be having that would help lead the relationship towards a decision, they're going to forego those just as a consequence of being complacent and of being content.
Here's a lie that a lot of guys buy into, that avoiding tension, avoiding conflict is somehow better for the relationship overall. It's going to make her think more favorably of you. Tension in general is frowned upon. But what's actually true, and you got to, and men will just have to walk this out to see it bear fruit. When you initiate difficult conversations, when you are able to enter into tension and navigate that and resolve that, when you can do that time and again, that actually shows her that you're willing to do something uncomfortable, you're willing to do hard things, and you're willing to problem solve, and that you're actually willing to figure out the difficult parts of life to get to a better place. And the funny thing is, that actually means more to her, is going to mean more to her, not in the moment. She'll be mad at you in the moment because she doesn't like tension either.
Yeah.
She doesn't like hard conversations. So in the moment, she might not be happy with you. But what actually comes to be is that over the long haul, over time, there actually is an appreciation there for you putting in that hard work.
That's really good. Another consequence that can happen from not being intentional is that resentment can build. And this probably is going to be more for her than it is going to be for the man. Because for most women who enter into a dating relationship, there is a desire for it to lead somewhere. Where? Marriage. That's not all women, but for, I would say, the majority of women who are in a dating relationship, that is what they're looking for. And so if a guy becomes complacent in that relationship and he's not moving towards a decision, she's watching her friends get engaged, get married, start to have families. And here she is still waiting for him to get off his butt and do something. And so it's easy for her to become resentful of him because he's not initiating towards a decision.
Because the reality is, for most women who desire a life that does not involve, say, a career or continued education, there are certain lifestyles where it'll be fine. For everything else, the woman's life and where she ends up going will depend on the decisions that a man makes.
Yep.
And so it's really unfair as a guy for you to expect her to be dependent on decisions you make, but then also drag your feet in making them.
It is unloving and unkind, which leads us into another consequence, which is the sunk cost effect. Obviously, that's a financial and an accounting term, a business term. But when it comes to relationships, really what we're talking about is this idea that you've invested so much time and energy and effort over a long period of time, maybe most likely years, potentially, God forbid, decades. And so the idea of starting over and losing out on that investment, it seems illogical because you're like, but I've already invested so much, so I've got to stick with this relationship because of everything I've already invested. It would be too much of a cost to start over.
Right, and that's a big fat lie. The time, the effort, everything you've done in dating up to today has no bearing on the future. Now, in marriage, things are going to be different.
Sure.
You've made a commitment, so there's no backing out of that one.
Come on.
But in dating, right, just because you've spent 6 months or a year, heaven forbid, multiple years dating, that doesn't somehow signal I need to continue doing this.
Yeah. And the final consequence that we're going to talk about today is what we've titled the Peter Pan boyfriend. Probably a lot of our listeners are familiar with the Peter Pan effect, which is the concept of a man who does not grow up, who does not mature, who does not move on in life. He just basically remains a child. The Peter Pan boyfriend is the idea that it is a man who doesn't want to grow out of the boyfriend status and state. He's content as a boyfriend, but he doesn't want to be a husband. He's content going on dates, but but he doesn't want to provide for you. He's content hanging out with you, but he doesn't want to protect you. He's not willing to commit and move on in the relationship because he loves being the perpetual boyfriend.
And I think for too many guys, they would rather continue in a dating relationship with no clear timeline than they would risk possibly moving things forward and having there be the opportunity for a breakup.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. So number 3 here, we have titled that comfort is the enemy of growth. Now, I think it's important to note that we are talking about the dating phase right now. So we're not talking about, in all of life. We're talking in a very specific season to a very specific set of people. And when it comes to a dating relationship, comfort is the enemy of growth.
And I think it's good to just be clear that comfort isn't a problem.
No.
It's the pursuit of comfort. And I think, comfort should be a byproduct of the decisions we make. One of.
Sure.
Of course, life could get too comfortable, but that's probably a different discussion. But it's the pursuit of comfort, or when comfort is prioritized over pretty much everything else, that's where the problems arise.
Because comfort ultimately undermines commitment in the dating phase. Because there is no reason to move towards commitment, towards covenant, because it's so comfortable as is. So why change that?
So men need to really buy into this idea that growth requires work, and they need to be willing to put in the work to see that growth comes about.
Because in a dating relationship, you should be continually working towards a decision. It's the people who aren't working towards a decision that suddenly complacency sets in, and they're just existing perpetually as the Peter Pan boyfriend.
Yeah, and some symptoms of that would look like, you date with no clear plan, or heaven forbid, you date for years.
Yeah. Or, you stop doing a lot of what you did initially that got her interested in you, or you start to assume that it matters less how you conduct yourself because she's going to be interested in me. She's my girlfriend. She's going to be here. And so instead of growing as a man, growing as a leader, growing as a relationship, you just begin to assume, well, this is great and this will never change. Therefore, I don't actually have to do anything differently.
And pretty soon you've settled into a new norm as a couple.
Oh my gosh.
Which I would actually push back against the title as a couple.
Yeah. You don't need that when you're dating.
Right.
You're not a couple.
Since when did couple come to define the dating phase as well?
Exactly.
Clearly in marriage you're a couple, and maybe it's just a nitpicky detail, but it's probably healthy to approach it more as we're not a couple than to think, okay, I'm dating and now we're a couple.
Yeah, your identity should not be we're a couple. Your identity, first of all, to the believer, should be in Christ and in Christ alone. And then beyond that, you have a vision for marriage. And once you're married, yeah, you're a couple. You're one, right? But before then, you're very much a single person who's pursuing a relationship. That's what you are. And the irony is this: every year that passes that you don't make a decision, that you don't work to move towards a decision, it becomes that much harder to then make any type of decision, which then it's like a negative feedback loop. It just like reinforces the comfortability that you're experiencing, and the idea of trying to get yourself out of it seems insurmountable. So you're like, I'll just stay in this position of being comfortable then.
The ability to make decisions is more or less a muscle that you work. And if you don't work that muscle, it's over time, it's actually going to be harder to make good decisions.
There's this great quote by Tim Keller that we have here. He says, just because you're comfortable doesn't mean it's good for you. Again, we're not anti-comfort. We're not asking that people's dating phase be terrible and miserable and, one day long and have no feelings and no emotions. Like, that's not what we're asking people to do. We're asking people to walk through this process with wisdom, intentionality, purpose, and vision so that they end up, hopefully, in a relationship that's going to lead towards covenant, and in that, find success. But just because you're comfortable, for all the couples out there who are listening, that doesn't mean it's necessarily good for you. It may be, but it may not be.
Right. And the criteria here is, don't prioritize comfort. Don't idolize comfort. It's when you pursue or desire a comfortable existence at the expense of other things.
Sure.
That's where the problems arise.
Okay, so number 4, how to avoid complacency. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are curious on how they can go about doing that. What would you recommend?
Well, I think the low-hanging fruit is to create a timeline.
Okay, what do you mean by timeline?
So you want to know where you're going. And my suggestion would be to actually know where you want to end up on a timeline before you actually start dating.
So like a specific date is what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, it can't hurt. And of course, plans can change.
Sure.
But better to enter into something with a plan than to start something with no plan and then have to figure it out.
So now for anyone who's listening, who's already in a relationship, who maybe have found themselves dating for years, how would a timeline help them at this moment?
It really comes down to them deciding, okay, we need to make a decision. It's time to make some choices. And of course, you're not going to do that in a vacuum.
No.
You're going to involve other people. It's going to involve both of you.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, all right, we've got to decide.
So let's break this down a little bit more practically, because I think it's really important that we equip men with some very practical things to do. So you want to create a timeline with a definitive date on it. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to sit down with your authority and accountability initially. This isn't a conversation you're initially going to have with the woman. You're going to sit down with authority and accountability. You're going to talk to them. You're going to invite in their counsel and their wisdom and their feedback into how long that timeline should be. Now, we would recommend that it should be no longer than 3 months because you just don't need any more time than that as a guy. And if our listeners think that that is way too short and that we're crazy, absolutely leave a comment. We'd love to hear how many years you think it should be before you can make a decision on a timeline here. But you're going to create a timeline with your authority and accountability. And then, like you said, you are going to sit down with the woman that you are pursuing romantically, and you are going to share with her your vision of moving towards a decision. And how you're going to have that conversation, what that conversation is going to entail may look different from person to person, but it's really important to make sure that you guys are on the same page as far as purpose of the relationship. Because if you sit down with her and you're like, hey, we've been dating for, 5 years. And I think that it would be wise for us to move towards marriage. And if her response is like, oh, bro, I didn't think that was this type of relationship. I thought we were just going to date. Well, now you kind of have your answer. What you do with that, there's a couple different directions you could head, but ultimately, clearly you're not headed in the same direction. And what's really good about that is now you've got some clarity with next steps.
And, practically speaking, we suggested 3 months. And if you say, well, that's too short, which it could be, I'm willing to entertain that, but decide, okay, why is it too short? What don't I know now that I need to know?
Yeah.
What's stopping me? What's telling me that 3 months is too short? And use those unknowns and work toward them, make them knowns.
You should not confuse longevity of relationship for the alignment of the purpose of the relationship. So many people think that because they've been in a dating relationship for years, that must mean they're aligned on the purpose of that relationship. That is not necessarily true.
It's not. And I would even say, in addition to that, there is this false belief that you find someone that you're aligned with. And I would suggest that's actually, alignment is something you work toward. Alignment takes work. The longer you live with somebody, you don't just naturally become more aligned with them.
It's true.
That's just not how it works.
Yeah, I mean, think about like your car, right? If your car is not aligned, driving it for a longer period of time isn't going to magically bring it into alignment. You actually have to take it off the road, bring it to a mechanic, get it realigned before you can continue driving. And in the same way with relationships, it's not like, well, if we just continue to date for years, we'll magically be aligned on vision and purpose.
Exactly. Being aligned with somebody takes discussion. It takes intentionality. It takes being purposeful. And over time, working with somebody in life, you come to alignment on things, but it takes work. It just doesn't happen by existing.
And dating for years doesn't necessarily mean that you're progressing towards something of value. It doesn't mean that you're headed towards a decision. You could be dating for years perpetually and not be headed towards anything of value. You just exist.
So on the timeline of a potential relationship for somebody, you only have whatever you spend in the beginning is at the expense of later on. Mm-hmm. You just can't have it any other way. So for a guy that wants to be married, if that's your goal, the longer you take to date, it's actually at the expense of what you eventually want. So think of it this way, we'll just use rough numbers here. 10%, say 10% of your relationship is dating and 90% is in marriage. Okay, a lot of guys, I think many guys will think, well, 10% is not enough. I need to go to 15% or I need to spend 20%. But you're doing that at the expense of where you eventually want to be. Mm-hmm. Why would you drag something out in the beginning when it's going to cost you something in the end of what you actually want?
And the irony is this, time is the one commodity that we don't get back. It is the most valuable thing we have. And for the vast majority of people who are in a relationship, they're looking for love. They're looking for commitment. They're looking for intimacy in relationship. Mm-hmm. So why would you want to extend the dating phase for multiple years to potentially find out it's not the person you're going to end up being with? Wouldn't you want to move through that faster, more efficiently, so that then you have a greater chance of finding the person and being with that person for the long haul of your life? And so the things we recommend, the intentionality, the vision, the purpose, all of those things are designed to equip men and women, but designed to equip men to be successful in pursuing a romantic relationship that leads towards a flourishing marriage. So as we conclude here, for anyone who's in a relationship, if anything we spoke about today resonates with you, you need to act this week. The irony is this, you can actually become complacent about not wanting to be complacent. So don't let that be you. And for anyone who's not in a relationship, take to heart the things we spoke about today, because it is so easy to fall into the trap of complacency, and you don't want that to be your story. As always, we love hearing from you. So drop a note on our social media, leave a comment, or send us an email. And we look forward to having you here next time on the Art of Pursuit podcast.